Yesterday, Queen Elizabeth II sadly passed away. Having served as Britain's monarch for 70 years, she worked alongside 15 prime ministers, from Churchill to Truss. She's been the cornerstone of the country for the entirety of my lifetime, and for the lifetime of most Brits alive right now. So it's understandable why many are feeling significant grief following her passing, with some serious confusion about what happens next for the country. So in this video, we're going to try and clear that up and put people's minds at ease. This is the official timeline of proceedings for the next 10 days, starting with her passing yesterday. Let's run through it now. The official planning documents, known as Operation London Bridge, refer to the day that the Queen dies as D-Day, on which a number of things happen. Now, the first sign we got yesterday that something was wrong was around 1 p.m, when a message from the palace emerged warning about the Queen's health. Shortly afterwards, it was announced that pretty much all of the royal family were headed for Balmoral, the Queen's royal residence in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. Now, people began to grow more concerned as the afternoon progressed, with the BBC cancelling all programming on BBC One in favour of rolling news coverage, and anchors on all channels swapping their outfits for black ties and dresses to reflect a more sombre mood. People's fears then became a reality just after 6:30 p.m, when it was announced that the Queen had indeed died. That announcement on the BBC looked like this.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The Palace has just issued this statement. It says the Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow.
With the announcement now official and the family customarily posting the official notification of the Queen's passing on the gates of Buckingham Palace, the plans went into full gear. As expected, the UK's new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, who was only appointed by the Queen on Tuesday, made a speech outside of Number 10.
We are all devastated by the news that we have just heard from Balmoral. Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. Through thick and thin, Queen Elizabeth II provided us with the stability and the strength that we needed. She was the very spirit of Great Britain, and that spirit will endure.
Shortly afterwards, the leader of the opposition Labour Party, Keir Starmer, made a similar speech. Personally though, the most affecting speech wasn't from either of the major British leaders, but rather from Justin Trudeau. As you might know, the Queen was Canada's head of state, and as such, Trudeau and the Queen met on a number of occasions, meaning unlike Britain's rotating cast of prime ministers, it seems that Trudeau was able to forge a real relationship with her.
She served us all with strength and wisdom for 70 years. As we grew into the diverse, optimistic, responsible, ambitious and extraordinary country we are today. As her 12th Canadian Prime Minister, I'm having trouble believing that my last sit-down with her was my last. I will so miss those chats. She was thoughtful, wise, curious, helpful, funny, and so much more. She was one of my favorite people in the world, and I will miss her so.
So, with some powerful remarks now made, and the country beginning to mourn the Queen's passing, what happens now? Well, you might remember that the Queen's death is referred to as D-Day in official planning documents. Well, the subsequent days are referred to as D plus a number. Essentially, as these plans were written a long time in advance, they needed a code to refer to the passage of time without assigning actual dates, although we now know what days each of these correspond with. It's worth saying, though, that a lot of these details are slightly up in the air at the moment. These plans might have been in the works for years, but some of the details are still kept secret, and with the Queen's death only being announced fairly late in the day on Thursday, some things which were supposed to happen on D-Day, the day of her death, weren't able to happen before the close of the day. So, while we did see a number of announcements, the Queen's family heading to Balmoral, and condolences from world leaders, we didn't see the Minister of Defence arranging gun salutes or a minute's silence as expected. Neither did the Prime Minister hold a meeting with the new King at 6 p.m, at least partly because the announcement actually happened after that. Nor did King Charles III address the nation as was planned. The final plan, which didn't happen on D-Day, was a service of remembrance in St Paul's Cathedral. The plan was for the Prime Minister and other ministers to attend, but due to time constraints, it wasn't able to happen on D-Day. Ultimately, all of these plans are only plans, and while we can expect other arrangements to be more strictly adhered to, it's understandable that not everything is going to run perfectly smoothly when it comes to something so rare and momentous. Regardless, with D-Day plans now in full swing, the UK officially entered a period of mourning, which is set to last until the Queen's official funeral. Now, official plans for the Queen's funeral were set to be unveiled on the day of the Queen's passing, but as you're probably expecting by now, circumstances changed. So, as of the time of writing, we don't yet know for sure when the funeral will take place, but it's expected to happen on D+10, or Sunday the 18th. Now, there was some speculation about whether the public could get a bank holiday on the day of the Queen's funeral, with some believing that a day off was a right upon the Queen's passing. Unfortunately for those hoping for an extra day off, that's not guaranteed. Nowhere within Queen's London Bridge plans is there a guarantee of a bank holiday, and while it would be marked as an official day of mourning, a bank holiday would be at the discretion of the Prime Minister. Now, that's not exactly helped by the fact that Liz Truss isn't the most bank holiday-friendly PM we've ever had, or the fact that the funeral is likely to land on a weekend anyway. So if your main interest in these proceedings was getting a day off work, you're likely to be disappointed. Regardless, what happens today and in the other days between the Queen's death and the funeral, which officially ends the mourning period? Well, we can expect a few things which were missed out of yesterday's schedule to make a reappearance today. With the gun salutes, the service, more details about the funeral, and an official address from the new King, all expected to be on the cards today. Parliament will likely also meet to pay their first condolences, as well as officially closing parliamentary business until the Queen's funeral. Now, this is obviously unfortunate timing, given the current crises facing the UK politically, and the fact that Truss has barely got her foot in the door at number 10. But official custom does suggest that parliamentary business will now be suspended for 10 days. Then, on Saturday, the Accession Council are expected to meet at 10 a.m. for the principal proclamation of the new King, the official process to make Charles the King, with them set to read the proclamation from a balcony in St James's Palace. Now, many expected this to happen on D+1, but due to the overrunning plans, it's now expected to happen on Saturday, D+2. Anyway, by this point, the new King will likely have also met with the Prime Minister, her cabinet, the Leader of the Opposition, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Dean of Westminster. Now, as the Queen died outside of London, the following days will simultaneously see the Queen's coffin making its way back to Buckingham Palace. More specifically, as the Queen died in Scotland, this activates a sub-plan within Operation London Bridge called Operation Unicorn, named after Scotland's official animal, which is, and this is totally serious, a unicorn. This means that, according to The Guardian, the Queen's coffin will be driven to the Palace of Holyrood in Edinburgh on D+2. Then, on D+3, there's expected to be a ceremonial procession from Holyrood along the Royal Mile to St Giles's Cathedral, where a ceremony will take place. Meanwhile, on Sunday, King Charles is expected to head to Westminster Hall, where he'll receive a motion of condolence, before flying to Edinburgh for his first official act as monarch, the ceremony of the Kings in Holyrood, before joining the Queen's coffin for the ceremony at St Giles's Cathedral. On Monday, D+4, the Queen's coffin will be transported to Edinburgh Waverley Station, where it will be transported overnight to London St Pancras, before finally making its way to Buckingham Palace on D+5. Now, we should note that other reports suggest the Queen's coffin will be flown back due to extenuating circumstances in this instance. But initial plans do suggest that the coffin will be transported via the royal train from Edinburgh to London. Regardless, from Buckingham Palace, the Queen's coffin will be officially moved to Westminster Hall in a gun carriage, part of a large ceremony that would have been rehearsed the previous day. For the next 5 days, the coffin will be laid to rest in Westminster Hall and is expected to be open to the public for 23 hours of the day, allowing people to pay their respects. Now, let's rewind a moment, because while the coffin is making its way down to London on Monday, the new king is headed to Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland, and then to St Anne's Cathedral in Belfast for a message of condolence and a service of condolence and prayer. Then on D+7, or Thursday the 15th, the king is expected to head to Wales for another message of condolence, this time at the Welsh Assembly, and another service at the cathedral in Cardiff. Now, we don't know how the king plans to get to Cardiff, but the RMT Union have announced that strikes that were planned on the railways on this Thursday and Saturday 17th will be cancelled to avoid disrupting anyone during the time of mourning. It's also on Thursday 15th that guests are expected to begin arriving for the funeral, with the king likely welcoming governors and prime ministers from across the Commonwealth on D+8, with overseas guests and VIPs expected to attend the lying in state on D+9. As I mentioned earlier, the timeline isn't 100% clear, but it's expected that the funeral will be held on D+10, or Sunday 18th. Now, getting to this point will require an immense amount of planning from the government, something which could prove to be Truss's first and very unexpected challenge. According to Politico's reporting, the biggest burden will land on 3 departments. The Foreign Office will be responsible for coordinating the arrival of MPs, heads of state, and VIPs, as well as dealing with the huge volume of tourists expected in London. The Home Office will be in charge of security and intelligence, something which is especially important given heightened terror risks. And the third major burden will be placed on the Department of Transport, who, despite the RMT's decision, will still need to handle massive overcrowding on the transport network, especially within London. Now, hopefully the new appointed ministers can handle all of that pressure, and on D+10, the funeral will be able to progress smoothly, with the Queen's coffin expected to be processed from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey on D+10, before a minute's silence is held across the country. Once the Queen reaches the Abbey, a 1-hour service is expected to pray for the Queen and remember her service. After which, a ceremony will transport her coffin through Hyde Park before being transferred from a gun carriage to a state hearse to then travel on to Windsor. Once in Windsor, a committal service is set to be held in St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, where the coffin will then be lowered into the royal vault. After all of this, the UK's official mourning period will be over, and at some point in the following days, the King's official coronation will take place. As I said, all of this is based on pre-planning documents, as well as reporting from outlets like Politico and The Guardian. But we've already seen how circumstances can throw off events. Regardless, I hope this outline is helpful and helps you better understand what's set to happen over the coming days, as well as hopefully setting your mind at ease. If you do want to follow things more closely over the days ahead and find out how things really play out, then we'll be covering developments in our show, The Daily Briefing. That's where we also break down other major news stories from around the world that you ought to know about. If you're interested in staying informed with us, then you can subscribe to the Daily Briefing channel on YouTube, or you can listen to the podcast by searching in your favorite podcast app.